"Get off my flight deck," the captain growled, throwing the checklist onto the console. "I don't fly with affirmative action hires, and I certainly don't trust my life to you people." He thought he was the king of the sky. He thought he could ruin her career with a single phone call. But Captain Richard Vance made one fatal calculation that rainy morning in Teterboro. He didn't know that the woman he was trying to kick off the plane didn't just work there. She owned the jet. She owned the airline. And in about 20 minutes, she was going to own him. Watch until the end to see instant karma hit harder than a Category 5 hurricane. The rain at Teterboro Airport, TEB, in New Jersey, was coming down in sheets, turning the grey tarmac into a sleek, reflective mirror. Standing beneath the shelter of the signature flight support overhang, Captain Richard Vance checked his Breitling Navitimer watch for the third time in 2 minutes. He was a man who wore his 50 years like a uniform, stiff, unyielding, and impeccably pressed. With silver hair swept back and a jawline that could cut glass, he looked every inch the veteran aviator. He also had the arrogance to match. Behind him sat the bird, a Gulfstream G650, tail number N780X. It was a $65 million machine capable of flying near the speed of sound. It belonged to Apex Horizon Aviation, a charter company known for catering to Wall Street billionaires and oil tycoons. Richard was the chief pilot for Apex, a position he guarded like a fortress. "Where is the damn first officer?" Richard muttered, snapping his umbrella open. Scheduling said they sent a replacement for Miller. "Relax, Cap," the ground handler, a young guy named Kevin, said as he loaded the last of the catering bags. "Traffic from the city is brutal. The Lincoln Tunnel is backed up." "I don't care about the tunnel," Richard snapped. "We have Mr. Sterling flying today. The man is the majority shareholder of the logistics firm acquiring our biggest client. If we miss our slot time for London, because some rookie can't set an alarm clock, heads will roll. Starting with yours." Kevin rolled his eyes when Richard turned away, but he said nothing. Richard Vance was known in the industry as a sky god, a pilot who believed his 4 bars made him a deity. He was technically brilliant, but a nightmare to work with. He had churned through 5 co-pilots in the last 6 months. Through the curtain of rain, a black town car pulled up to the FBO entrance. Richard narrowed his eyes. Finally. The door opened and a woman stepped out. She opened a large black umbrella, shielding herself from the downpour. She was wearing a trench coat, but beneath it, the flash of a white collar and a black tie was visible. She reached into the trunk, pulled out a flight bag, and thanked the driver. She was black, tall, and moved with a distinct, calm elegance. She walked toward the jet, her gaze fixed on the aircraft, scanning the fuselage as she approached, a habit of a seasoned aviator doing a mental walk-around. Richard stepped out to intercept her, blocking her path to the aircraft stairs. "You're late," Richard barked over the sound of the rain and the whining APU of a nearby Challenger jet. The woman stopped. She looked at Richard, her expression unreadable. She had high cheekbones and eyes that were sharp, intelligent, and currently unimpressed. "Good morning, Captain. I'm actually 20 minutes early for the crew call. The flight plan isn't filed for another hour." Richard scoffed, looking her up and down. "I'm not talking about the flight plan. I'm talking about the catering. The VIPs requested the beluga caviar, not the sevruga. Did you check it before you left the commissary?" The woman tilted her head slightly. "I wouldn't know, Captain. I'm not the flight attendant." Richard paused. He looked at her flight bag, a heavy leather saddlebag used by pilots, not the roller bags usually carried by cabin crew. He looked at her shoes, sensible, polished flight boots. Then he looked at her face again. "You're the replacement." The disgust in his voice was immediate and undisguised. "I'm First Officer David Rostova," she said, extending a hand. The name sounded foreign, perhaps Russian, which confused him even more given her appearance. "I've been assigned to the N7 Aarhus X for the London leg." Richard didn't take her hand. He let it hang there in the cold, damp air until she slowly lowered it. "Rostova?" Richard laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Scheduling must be playing a joke. This is a G-Lieutenant 50 ER, sweetheart. It's not a Cessna 172 you rent on the weekends to fly your church group around. This requires a type rating and at least 3,000 hours in command." "I have 4,000 hours on type, Captain," David said, her voice remaining eerily calm, "and 8,000 total time. I was previously flying Global 7500s out of Dubai." "Dubai?" Richard sneered. "Right, probably falsified logs. I know how it works over there. And I know how it works here. You're a diversity check mark. Apex is trying to look progressive for the IPO, so they stick me with a token in the right seat." He stepped closer, invading her personal space. "Listen to me clearly. I don't fly with affirmative action. I fly with aviators. You are going to turn around, get back in that car, and tell scheduling you're sick. If you don't, I will make the next 8 hours of your life a living hell." David didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She simply adjusted her grip on her flight bag. "The clients are arriving in 45 minutes, Captain Vance. Unless you plan on flying this jet single pilot, which is illegal under Part 135 regulations, you need me. I suggest we get the pre-flight done." She sidestepped him and walked up the airstairs. Richard stood there, rain dripping from the rim of his hat, his face turning a shade of crimson. "Oh, you have no idea what you just did," he hissed to himself. He followed her up the stairs, slamming the door behind him. The cockpit of the G650 is a marvel of modern engineering. Glass screens, sheepskin seats, and the smell of expensive leather and avionics cooling fans. It is usually a sanctuary for pilots. Today, it was a cage fight. David was already in the right seat, moving through the flow pattern with practiced efficiency. Her hands danced over the overhead panel, checking circuit breakers and initializing the flight management system, FMS. She moved with a grace that only comes from years of muscle memory. Richard threw his jacket onto the jump seat and squeezed into the captain's chair on the left. He didn't start his checks. Instead, he swiveled his chair to face her. "Don't touch the FMS," he ordered. David's fingers hovered over the keypad. "I'm loading the route to Luton, Captain. If we don't get the clearance request in now, we'll miss the slot." "I said don't touch it," Richard shouted. The sound reverberated in the small space. "I don't trust you to program a microwave, let alone a flight computer. Let me see your license and medical." David sighed, a sound of patience wearing thin. She reached into her breast pocket and produced her FAA certificate and first-class medical. She handed them over. Richard scrutinized them, holding them up to the light as if looking for a watermark of forgery. "David Rostova. Issued 3 years ago." He squinted. "Who signed you off?" "Czech Airman Stevens? Never heard of him. Probably some bleeding heart who passes anyone with a sob story." He tossed the license back at her. It fluttered onto the center pedestal. "Here's how this is going to work," Richard said, leaning in. "You don't touch the radios. You don't touch the throttle. You don't even look at the landing gear lever unless I tell you to. You are here as a warm body to satisfy the FAA requirement. As far as I'm concerned, you are a passenger in a uniform. If you speak to the clients, you're fired. If you make a mistake, I'm writing you up. Am I clear?" David picked up her license and tucked it away. She looked him dead in the eye. "Captain, I am responsible for the safety of this flight just as much as you are. Crew resource management dictates that we work together. If you incapacitate my ability to perform my duties, you are endangering the passengers. I am the safety of this flight. Richard slammed his hand on the armrest. Me. I have 20 years at Apex. I flew F-16s while you were playing with dolls. Don't quote the manual to me, little girl. Just then, the interphone chimed. It was the flight attendant, Sarah, from the cabin. Captain, Sarah's voice came through nervously. The VIP cars are pulling up to the plane side. It's Mr. Sterling and his entourage. Richard's demeanor changed instantly. The snarl vanished, replaced by a practiced, oily charm. Copy that, Sarah. I'll be right down to greet them. He glared at David one last time. Stay here. Don't show your face. I don't want them thinking we're running a charity operation. Richard unbuckled and squeezed past her, heading out to the cabin to greet the billionaire. David sat alone in the cockpit. She listened to the rain drumming on the fuselage. Slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a phone. It wasn't her personal phone. It was a satellite-encrypted device. She typed a quick message. He's worse than the reports said. Proceed with the audit. She hit send, then turned back to the FMS. She programmed the route to London Luton in under 30 seconds. She entered the performance data, checked the fuel loads, and set the V-speeds. She did it all while Richard was outside, bowing and scraping to the man he thought was the boss. Little did Richard know, he was bowing to the wrong person. Down on the tarmac, the rain had lightened to a drizzle. 2 black SUVs idled by the stairs. Richard stood at the bottom of the steps, his uniform jacket buttoned, his hat tucked under his arm, a wide, obsequious smile plastered on his face. A tall, elderly man with white hair stepped out of the first SUV. This was Arthur Sterling, the public face of the Sterling Group. He was a man of old money and few words. Behind him came his team, lawyers, assistants, and analysts. Mr. Sterling, Richard said, offering a firm handshake. Welcome aboard the flagship. It's an honor to fly you to London today. We have a smooth ride anticipated once we punch through this weather system. Arthur Sterling looked at Richard with tired eyes. Captain Vance, good to see you. We're in a hurry. The merger meeting starts 2 hours after we land. Understood, sir. We'll make up time in the air. I've got the engines warm and ready. Arthur paused on the second step. Is the co-pilot situation sorted? My assistant mentioned the regular first officer was out sick. Ah, yes. Richard's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Scheduling center. Replacement. A bit green, honestly. But don't worry, sir. I'll be handling all the complex maneuvers personally. You're in the safest hands in the business. Arthur raised an eyebrow. Green? I don't pay for green, Captain. I pay for perfection. And you have it with me, sir? Richard assured him quickly. I'll keep her out of the way. You won't even know she's there. Arthur grunted and boarded the plane. Richard followed, closing the heavy main door and locking it with a satisfying thud. Inside the cabin, the luxury was palpable. Cream leather, walnut wood trim, and crystal glassware. Sarah, the flight attendant, was already pouring champagne. Richard poked his head into the cockpit. David was strapped in, reviewing the departure chart on her iPad. They're on board, Richard hissed. Engine start checklist, and remember what I said. Mouth shut, hands in your lap. Checklist is complete, Captain, David said calmly. APU is running. Bleeds are on. Ready for start on number 2. Richard grumbled, annoyed that she was ahead of him. He sat down and put on his headset. Tower, Gulfstream 780 X-ray, ready for taxi with information Zulu. As they taxied out, Richard made a point of micromanaging every switch David touched. Flaps 20, he barked. Flaps 20 set. she replied. Don't ride the brakes, he criticized, even though her feet weren't even on the pedals. They held short of runway 19. The tower cleared them for takeoff. My controls, Richard announced unnecessarily. Your controls, David confirmed. Richard pushed the throttles forward. The Rolls-Royce engines roared to life, pressing them back into their seats. The jet surged forward. V1, David called out smoothly. Rotate. V2. Positive rate, David said. Gear up. Richard yanked the gear lever up. They climbed steeply into the grey overcast. As they broke through the cloud layer into the blinding sunlight at 30,000 feet, Richard engaged the autopilot and let out a breath. He turned to David, a smug grin on his face. See that? That's how you fly a jet. Maybe one day, if you study hard, you'll learn to do half of that. David ignored the insult. Captain, we have a message from the company via ACARS, Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System. Operations wants us to divert. Richard frowned. Divert? What are you talking about? We just took off. It says, urgent request from owner. Divert to Boston Logan immediately. Richard's face turned pale. Boston? We can't divert. Sterling has a meeting in London. If we divert, he misses the merger. It's a direct order from the ownership group, Captain, David said, pointing to the screen. This must be a mistake, Richard snapped. Or maybe you entered the wrong code and triggered a default message. I told you not to touch the FMS. He grabbed the satellite phone handset to call operations. I'm going to call dispatch and get this sorted. You probably screwed up the data link. He dialed the number for the chief pilot's office. Yeah, this is Vance on 780. I got a weird ACARS message about diverting to Boston. We have Mr. Sterling on board. We are not diverting. Over. There was a pause. Then the voice of the director of operations, usually a friend of Richard's, came over the line, cold and hard. Vance, the order didn't come from me. It came from the board. You are to land in Boston immediately. There is a personnel issue that needs to be resolved before the flight continues across the Atlantic. Personnel issue? Richard looked at David. What personnel issue? They didn't say. Just land the damn plane, Richard, or you'll be flying cargo rubber dog shit out of Hong Kong by tomorrow. Click. Richard stared at the handset. He turned to David, his eyes narrowing into slits. You did something. Did you complain? Did you text someone while I was doing the walk around? David looked out the window at the horizon. I haven't spoken to dispatch, Captain. But if there is a personnel issue, perhaps it's best we resolve it on the ground. I know what this is, Richard seethed, his face turning red again. You played the race card. You realized you couldn't handle the pressure of a real flight, so you cried to HR that I was being mean to you. Now I have to land and explain to a billionaire that we're stopping because his diversity hire Copilot got her feelings hurt. He disengaged the autopilot and banked the plane aggressively to the left. Fine, we'll go to Boston. And when we land, I am going to personally escort you off this plane and make sure you never work in aviation again. Not even flying drones. He keyed the mic to the cabin. Mr. Sterling, this is the captain. I apologize, but we have a technical administrative issue involving one of the crew members. We have to make a quick stop in Boston. It will only take 30 minutes. He didn't wait for a response. He started the descent. David remained silent, but a small, cold smile touched her lips. Richard thought he was landing to fire her. He had no idea he was landing to attend his own funeral. The descent into Boston Logan International Airport was anything but smooth. Richard flew the G650ER like he was wrestling a bear, making aggressive inputs on the yoke that sent subtle shudders through the airframe. It was a rookie display of anger, manifesting as poor airmanship. Boston approach, Gulfstream 780 X-ray, level 4000, established ILS, runway 4 right, Richard barked into the radio. Gulfstream 0 X-ray, cleared to land, 4 right. Contact tower on 128.8, the controller replied. Inside the cockpit, the silence between the two pilots was toxic. David monitored the instruments, her hands resting lightly on her knees, ready to intervene if Richard's rage caused him to destabilize the approach. "Gear down," Richard snapped. "Gear down, 3 green," David confirmed neutrally. "You enjoy this view?" Richard sneered, glancing at her as the Boston skyline loomed through the clouds. "Take a good look. It's the last time you'll see a runway from the front seat. As soon as we block in, I'm stripping your epaulets. I'm going to make sure you're blacklisted from every Part 135 operator on the East Coast. You'll be lucky to drive a baggage cart after I'm done with you." David didn't look at him. "Focus on the center line, Captain. You're drifting left." "I know how to fly my damn plane," he shouted, yanking the yoke right. The tires screeched onto the wet runway, a firm, jarring landing that would definitely be felt in the VIP cabin. Richard slammed the thrust reversers, slowing the 60-ton jet aggressively. He exited the runway and taxied toward the General Aviation Terminal, known as the Signature Flight Support, FBO. As soon as the parking brake was set, Richard ripped his headset off. "Get your bags. You're off the flight." He stormed out of the cockpit before the engines had even fully spooled down. David completed the shutdown checklist methodically. She turned off the fuel pumps, the hydraulics, and the avionics. She took a deep breath, smoothed her tie, and stood up. In the main cabin, chaos was brewing. Arthur Sterling was standing, looking furious. "Captain Vance!" Sterling shouted. "What is the meaning of this? Why are we in Boston? I have a merger worth $4 billion happening in London in 6 hours." Richard put on his most apologetic, victimized face. He gestured dramatically toward the cockpit door where David was emerging. "Mr. Sterling, I cannot apologize enough," Richard said, his voice dripping with faux sincerity. "It's my first officer. She had a panic attack. She claimed she couldn't handle the workload. She demanded we land. For your safety, I couldn't continue across the Atlantic with a crew member who is mentally unstable." Sterling looked at David. She stood tall, her face calm, holding her flight bag. "Unstable?" Sterling asked, eyeing her. "She looks perfectly fine to me." "It's an act, sir," Richard whispered loudly. "These affirmative action hires, they crumble under pressure. But don't worry. I've radioed ahead. The company has a replacement pilot waiting here in Boston. We'll dump her, grab the new guy, and be in the air in 20 minutes. I'll make up the time." David walked past them toward the open main door. She paused next to Sterling. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice cool and commanding, "I apologize for the delay. The captain is correct that there is a personnel issue, but he is incorrect about who is leaving the aircraft." Richard laughed, a sharp, incredulous sound. "Get off my plane, Rostova. Go cry to HR." David descended the stairs. A black sedan was waiting on the tarmac, but it wasn't a taxi. It was a Mercedes Maybach with tinted windows. Standing next to it, holding an umbrella, was a man in a sharp grey suit. Richard followed her down, eager to see her humiliation. "Look," he mocked. "HR sent a car to take you to the bus station." Richard walked up to the man in the grey suit. It was Marcus Henderson, the director of operations for Apex Horizon, Richard's direct boss. "Marcus!" Richard exclaimed, relieved. "Thank God you're here. This woman is a disaster. Insubordinate, incompetent, and she forced a diversion. I want her fired immediately. I want her gone before we refuel." Marcus Henderson didn't smile. He didn't offer a handshake. He looked at Richard with a mixture of pity and fear. Then he looked past Richard, toward David. Marcus snapped his umbrella shut and bowed his head slightly to the female co-pilot. "Good morning, Madam Chairman," Marcus said. "I trust the flight from Teterboro was illuminating?" The rain pattered softly against the fuselage of the Gulf Stream. For a moment, the only sound was the whining of the wind and the distant roar of a 730 FN taking off. Richard froze. He looked at Marcus, then at David, then back at Marcus. His brain refused to process the words. "Marcus, what did you call her?" Richard asked, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. "She's the relief pilot, Rostova, the temp." David handed her flight bag to the driver of the Maybach. She brushed a speck of lint off her trench coat and turned to face Richard. The warmth was gone from her eyes, replaced by the cold, hard steel of a corporate executioner. "I am David Rostova," she said, "but you might know me better by my married name. David Sterling." Richard's eyes widened. He whipped his head around to look at the plane, where Arthur Sterling was standing at the top of the stairs, watching the scene unfold. "Sterling," Richard stammered. You're related to the client." "Arthur is my father-in-law," David said. "But that's not why I'm here. 2 months ago, my private equity firm, Aurora Capital, acquired a controlling interest in Apex Horizon Aviation. We bought the entire airline, Richard. I own the hangars, I own the maintenance contracts, and I own this Gulf Stream Gielen-Maviaf-Hofer." The blood drained from Richard's face so fast it looked like he was about to faint. His knees actually buckled slightly. The pale look the prompt asked for was complete. He looked like a ghost. You own the company," he whispered. "I do," David said, stepping closer. The height difference seemed to vanish. She towered over him with sheer presence. "We received multiple complaints about the culture at Apex. Complaints about sexism, racism, and a god complex among the senior captains. I wanted to see if it was true. I figured the best way to audit the cockpit culture was to sit in the right seat and see how you treat someone you think is beneath you." Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Madame, Mrs. Sterling, I didn't know. If I had known, it was you." "That is exactly the point, Captain," David cut him off sharply. "If you knew who I was, you would have kissed my ring. You would have been charming, professional, and courteous. But because you thought I was just a black female pilot trying to do her job, you treated me like garbage. You questioned my credentials, you insulted my background, and you endangered the safety of this flight with your temper tantrum on the approach." Arthur Sterling walked down the stairs, holding a glass of scotch. He stood next to his daughter-in-law. "I told you, David," Arthur said, shaking his head at Richard. "I told you Vance was a dinosaur. I didn't think he was this bad, though. Panic attack. Really, Richard, you lied to me to cover your own ego?" "Mr. Sterling, please," Richard begged, sweat mixing with the rain on his forehead. "It was a misunderstanding. I'm old school. I run a tight ship. I was just testing her. It was a stress test to see if she could handle the cockpit." "You failed the test, Richard," David said. She reached out her hand. "Give me your epaulets and your company ID." You can't do this," Richard stammered. "I'm the chief pilot. The union protects pilots against unfair dismissal," Marcus Henderson interjected, stepping forward. "It doesn't protect management pilots against gross misconduct, insubordination to the owner, and discrimination. You're an at-will employee, Richard, and your will has just expired." David didn't wait. She reached out and physically ripped the Velcro epaulets, the 4 gold bars he cherished so much, off his shoulders. She tossed them onto the wet tarmac. "You are relieved of command, effective immediately," she stated. "You are not to step foot on any Apex property again. Your personal items in the cockpit will be mailed to you." Richard stood there, stripped of his rank, soaking wet in the Boston rain. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him. He wasn't just fired, he was destroyed. In the tight-knit world of corporate aviation, getting fired by the owner for racism mid-trip was a career death sentence. Word would spread to Tatterborough, Van Nuys, and Farnborough before the sun set. "Marcus," Richard pleaded, turning to his former friend, "I have a mortgage. My daughter is in college. You can't let her do this." Marcus looked away. "You did this to yourself, Rick. I warned you last month about your attitude with the junior pilots. You said I was being woke. Well, wake up." David turned to Marcus. "Is Captain Jenkins here?" "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said. "He's in the FBO lounge, pre-flighted and ready to go." "Good," David said. "Send him out. I'll take the left seat for the leg to London. Jenkins can fly first officer." Richard's jaw dropped. You're going to fly the client. But the insurance. My insurance," David reminded him icily. "And unlike you, I keep my skills sharp. I don't rely on autopilot to mask my incompetence." She turned back to the car. "Marcus, please ensure Mr. Vance is escorted off the airport grounds. His security clearance is revoked. If he tries to re-enter the ramp, call the state police." "Yes, ma'am." As David and Arthur turned to walk back up the stairs to the warm, dry luxury of the Gulf Stream, Richard made one last, desperate attempt to salvage his pride. "You tricked me," he shouted at her back. "This was entrapment. You set me up." David stopped on the third step. She turned around, looking down at him one last time. "I didn't set you up, Richard," she said softly, but her voice carried over the wind. "I just gave you a mirror. You're the one who decided to show us an ugly reflection." She signaled to the flight attendant. "Close the door, Sarah." The heavy door of the Gulf Stream motored upward, shutting Richard out. He heard the mechanical thunk of the locking pins engaging. A moment later, the APU ramped up to a scream. The engines whined to life, blasting hot exhaust across the wet tarmac. Richard was forced to step back, shielding his face. He watched as the plane, his plane, the bird he had captained for 5 years, taxied away without him. He saw the face of Captain Jenkins in the right seat, and in the left seat, the silhouette of David Sterling, her hands firmly on the tiller, guiding the $65 million jet toward the runway. Richard stood alone on the ramp. A security guard in a yellow vest approached him. "Sir," the guard said, pointing to a gate in the chain-link fence far away. "You need to vacate the secure area. You don't have a badge anymore." I need to get back to New Jersey," Richard mumbled. "I don't have my wallet. It's in my flight bag, on the plane." "That's a bummer, pal," the guard said unsympathetically. "You can call a cab from the public terminal, but you got to walk there." Richard Vance, the sky god, the man who thought he owned the heavens, began the long, humiliating walk in the rain toward the public exit. He had no umbrella. He had no job. And as he checked his phone, he saw a notification from LinkedIn. Apex Horizon Aviation has updated its leadership page. New chief pilot appointed. Richard Vance, terminated. The internet moves fast. Karma moves faster. The walk from the signature flight support ramp to the public terminal at Boston Logan was less than a mile, but for Richard Vance, it felt like a death march. The rain had intensified, soaking through his thin white pilot's shirt, making the fabric cling to his skin like a cold shroud. Without his epaulets, which still lay in a puddle on the tarmac where David had tossed them, he looked like a man in a costume that no longer fit. He didn't have his wallet. He didn't have his passport. He didn't have his flight bag containing his logbooks, his headset, or his car keys. All of it was locked inside the belly of the Gulfstream G650ER that was currently hurtling toward the Atlantic Ocean without him. Richard reached the public terminal, shivering uncontrollably. He patted his wet trousers and found his phone. 12% battery. He dialed his wife, Linda. "Rick," she answered, her voice tight. "You're supposed to be in the air. Why are you calling?" I had a situation," Richard stammered, huddled near the automatic sliding doors, watching travelers with luggage pass him by. "I need you to book me a car from Boston to New Jersey. Uber. Black car. Whatever. I don't have my credit cards." "A situation?" Linda asked. "Rick, I just saw a post on the pilots forum. Someone took a picture of you standing on the ramp in the rain. They're saying you got pulled off the Sterling flight. They're saying you tried to kick the owner off the plane." Richard's stomach dropped. "It's a lie. It's exaggerated. Just get me a car, Linda." "I can't," she said, her voice turning cold. "The company credit card, the one we use for everything, just got declined at the grocery store." "They cut you off, Rick. They cut us off." "What?" Richard shouted, drawing stares from a passing family. "You fix this," Linda snapped. "Don't come home until you fix this." The line went dead. Richard sat on a plastic bench in the baggage claim area, a man who had flown billionaires and royalty, now waiting for his phone to die, wondering how he was going to afford a bus ticket. 2 weeks later, the silence in the Vance household was deafening. Richard sat in his home office, a room decorated with models of every jet he had ever flown, and framed photos of him shaking hands with CEOs. He was making calls. He had expected a suspension, maybe a demotion to a smaller aircraft. He hadn't expected the nuclear fallout that followed. "Bob, how are you?" Richard said into the phone, forcing a cheerful tone. He was calling Robert Halloway, the chief pilot at Titan Jet, a competitor to Apex. "Look, I'm putting feelers out. I decided to leave Apex. Cultural differences, you know how it is. I'm available for the Global Express fleet." There was a long, uncomfortable pause on the other end. "Rick, don't do this to me," Bob said quietly. "Do what?" "Don't make me say it. We got the memo, Rick. Everyone got the memo." "What memo?" Richard's grip on the phone tightened. Apex Horizon sent out a formal "do not hire" advisory to the safety roundtable, Bob explained. It's standard for gross misconduct, but... Rick, they attached the cockpit voice recording, the transcript of what you said to her. Affirmative action hire. Passenger in a uniform. Richard closed his eyes. "It's toxic, Rick," Bob continued. "We have female pilots. We have minority pilots. If I hired you, my entire flight department would walk out. You're radioactive. My insurance underwriter explicitly told me that if you are on the payroll, our liability premiums go up by 40%. You're a liability risk." "I have 20,000 hours!" Richard screamed at the receiver. "I am an ace-qualified pilot." "You were," Bob corrected him. "Now, you're just the guy who tried to big-league David Sterling. Good luck, Rick." The line clicked. Richard tried the cargo haulers. He tried the regional airlines. He even tried a skydiving school in upstate New York. The answer was always the same. The aviation world is a small village, and Richard Vance had burned down the village square. The financial collapse was swift and brutal. The lifestyle Richard had built was leveraged on a $350,000 annual salary. Without it, the house of cards crumbled. First, the Porsche 911 went, then the boat. Then, 3 months later, Linda filed for divorce. She cited irreconcilable differences. But Richard knew the truth. She had married a captain. She wasn't interested in being married to an unemployed, bitter man who spent his days drinking scotch and ranting about woke culture to the television. 6 months after the incident at Teterboro, the bank foreclosed on the house. Richard Vance, the former sky god, moved into a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in Queens. But rock bottom hadn't even arrived yet. 1 year later. The wind in Bethel, Alaska, does not blow. It screams. It is a living, malevolent force that tears across the flat, treeless tundra, searching for any exposed skin to turn black with frostbite. On this particular Tuesday morning in February, the thermometer outside the corrugated metal hangar read 28 degrees below zero. Inside the hangar, it was perhaps 10 degrees warmer, smelling of spilled aviation gas, stale coffee, and the lingering copper tang of frozen blood. Richard Vance, the man who once sipped espresso at 45,000 feet in a climate-controlled cockpit while wearing a bespoke Italian suit, was currently on his hands and knees in a pool of hydraulic fluid. He was wearing a bulky, grease-stained parka that was 3 sizes too big, secured with duct tape where the zipper had failed. His pants were heavy insulated bibs, stiff with frozen oil. His hands, once manicured and insured for their dexterity, were now raw, chapped, and mapped with cuts that refused to heal in the dry, Arctic air. "Vance, move your ass!" A voice boomed from the open cargo door of the aircraft above him. "We're burning daylight, and the weather front is moving in. If we get grounded here overnight, I'm taking the cost of the hotel out of your pay." Richard gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw bunching tight. He grabbed the heavy wrench and stood up, his knees popping audibly. He looked up at the aircraft. It wasn't a sleek Gulfstream. It was a Douglas DC-6, a 4-engine piston pounder built in 1956. It was a flying semi-truck, a relic held together by safety wire and prayers, used to haul supplies to the remote villages of the bush. "I'm clearing the strut, Tyler," Richard shouted back, his voice cracking in the cold. "The oleo was leaking. I had to tighten the seal." "I don't care about the seal. I care about the schedule, Captain Tyler." "Cowboy," Jenkins replied, leaning out of the cockpit window. Tyler was 24 years old. He had patchy facial hair, a lip packed full of chewing tobacco, and a total flight time of 1,500 hours, most of which he had gained in a Cessna 172. In Richard's previous life, Tyler wouldn't have been qualified to clean the windshield of his jet. Here, at Northern Hall Logistics, Tyler was the pilot in command. He was the captain. And Richard was the right seat meat, the loadmaster, the glorified mechanic who sat in the co-pilot's chair only because insurance required 2 bodies in the cockpit. "Get the pallets loaded," Tyler spat, a glob of brown tobacco juice landing in the snow dangerously close to Richard's boot. "We got 2 tons of frozen salmon and a snowmobile to get to Anchorage." Richard swallowed his pride. It tasted like bile. "Copy that, Captain." The work was brutal. At Apex Horizon, Richard had never touched a piece of luggage. He had people for that. He had ramp agents, concierges, and flight attendants. Now, he was the mule. He spent the next 45 minutes heaving wooden crates onto the conveyor belt and shoving them into the dark, freezing belly of the DC-6. The cargo hold smelled of fish and diesel. The boxes were heavy, slippery with ice, and splintered. One crate of king crab legs snagged on his glove, tearing the fabric and slicing his palm. Richard gasped, clutching his hand. Blood welled up, bright red against the dirty grey floor. "You okay back there?" Tyler's voice crackled over the intercom speaker mounted on the wall. "Stop taking breaks." "I cut my hand," Richard yelled at the wall. "Don't bleed on the cargo," came the reply. "Tape it up and let's go." Richard stared at the speaker, the rage that lived in his chest, a hot, molten ball of fury, flared up. He wanted to scream. He wanted to storm into the cockpit and tell this insolent child that he was Richard Vance, a former chief pilot, a man who had flown senators and CEOs. He wanted to explain that he knew more about aerodynamics than Tyler would learn in a lifetime, but he didn't. He couldn't. Because Richard Vance was broke. The lawsuit from Apex Horizon for breach of fiduciary duty and reputational damages had taken his savings. The divorce had taken the rest. This job, this miserable, freezing, back-breaking job paying $18 an hour, was the only thing keeping him from homelessness. He was blacklisted everywhere else. The FAA had investigated him, and while he kept his license, his reputation was so toxic that no reputable carrier would touch him. So, Richard pulled a roll of electrical tape from his pocket, wrapped his bleeding hand tight, and shoved the last crate into place. "Cabin secure," he mumbled into the intercom. "About time," Tyler said. "Get up front." The cockpit of the DC-6 was a sensory nightmare. Unlike the silent, glass-screened sanctuary of the Gulf Stream, this cockpit was a chaotic mess of analog dials, shaking needles, and deafening noise. When Tyler fired up the 4 radial engines, the entire airframe shuddered violently. The noise was a physical assault, a constant, thundering roar that rattled Richard's teeth. There was no heating in the footwell. Richard's toes were numb blocks of ice. "Read the checklist," Tyler ordered, not even looking at him. Tyler was scrolling through Instagram on his phone, looking at pictures of a girl in a bikini in Miami. Richard picked up the laminated, grease-stained checklist. "Cowl flaps." "Set," Tyler mumbled, still looking at his phone. "Mixture. Auto-rich. Transponder. It's broken. We're flying VFR. Just read the engine gauges, old man." Richard tightened his lap belt. He looked at the instrument panel. The attitude indicator was precessing. The altimeter had a crack in the glass. "Tyler, the oil pressure on number 3 is hovering near the red line. It's low." Tyler finally looked up, rolling his eyes. "It always runs low in the cold. It'll warm up. Stop acting like a safety inspector. You're here to swing the gear and talk to ATC if I'm eating." They taxied out onto the runway, the wheels crunching over patches of packed ice. Tyler lined up the beast and shoved the throttles forward. The noise rose to a deafening crescendo. The plane didn't so much take off as it was bullied into the air. They clawed their way into the grey, turbulent sky, tossed around by the Arctic winds like a leaf in a storm. Richard's hands hovered near the yoke, his muscle memory screaming at him to correct Tyler's sloppy flying. The kid was over-controlling, banking too hard, letting the nose wander. It was amateur hour. "Watch your airspeed," Richard cautioned involuntarily. "You're getting slow on the climb out." Tyler snapped his head around, his eyes blazing. "Get your hands off the quadrant. I'm flying this plane. You touch the controls and I'll leave you on the tarmac in Anchorage." Richard pulled his hands back as if burned. He sat there, humiliated, staring out the window at the endless, unforgiving white emptiness of the Alaskan wilderness. This was his prison. 2 hours into the flight, the turbulence was relentless. Richard was nauseous. The smell of the frozen fish from the back was seeping into the cockpit. He needed to use the bathroom, but there was no bathroom on a cargo DC-6. There was a relief tube, a funnel with a hose attached to the wall in the back of the fuselage, freezing cold and undignified. He unbuckled. "I need to check the cargo straps," he lied. He stumbled back into the dark cargo hold. He did his business in the freezing cold, swaying with the violent motion of the plane, surrounded by dead fish. As he zipped up, the plane hit a massive air pocket, dropping 200 feet in a second. Richard was thrown into the air. He slammed hard against a wooden pallet, his ribs cracking against the corner of a crate. He collapsed onto the metal floor, gasping for air, pain radiating through his chest. He lay there in the dark, clutching his side. Tears, hot and angry, pricked his eyes. He remembered the Gulf Stream. He remembered the smell of the leather seats. He remembered the taste of the fresh coffee the flight attendant would bring him. He remembered the way David Rostova had looked at him, calm, professional, dignified, while he sneered at her. "Karma," he whispered into the darkness, his breath visible in the freezing air. "This is it." "Vance!" Tyler's voice screamed over the intercom. "Get back up here! The heater on the windshield failed. I need you to scrape the ice on the inside." Richard groaned, forcing himself to his feet. His ribs screamed in protest. He limped back to the cockpit. Sure enough, the heating element in the captain's windshield had shorted out. A layer of frost was forming on the inside of the glass, obscuring Tyler's view. "Scrape it," Tyler ordered, tossing a plastic credit card at him. Richard stood awkwardly between the seats, reaching over the captain's shoulder, frantically scraping ice off the glass with a credit card, while the plane bounced through the turbulence. He was panting, sweating in his parka, his side throbbing. "Faster!" Tyler yelled. "I can't see the horizon." "I'm trying," Richard wheezed. "You're useless, Vance. I swear you're the worst co-pilot I've ever had. No wonder they fired you." The words cut deeper than the cold. Richard paused for a fraction of a second, looking at the side of Tyler's face. He wanted to hit him. He wanted to strangle him, but he kept scraping. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Like a servant. Like a peasant. They landed in Anchorage in a blinding snowstorm. It was a terrifying, hard landing. Tyler slammed the bird onto the runway, bouncing twice before reversers kicked in. As they taxied to the cargo ramp, Richard saw it. Parked at the signature flight support terminal, basking under the floodlights, was a line of private jets. And there, sitting majestically among them, was a Gulfstream G650ER. It wasn't the Gulfstream. It wasn't N80X. But it was close enough. It was pristine, white, and beautiful. Through the cockpit window, Richard could see the pilots shutting down. They were wearing crisp white shirts with gold bars. They were laughing. A fuel truck was pulling up. A limousine was waiting on the tarmac for the passengers. Richard watched them through the scratched, frosted window of the DC-6. He watched a world he had been evicted from. "Shutdown checklist," Tyler barked, cutting off Richard's view. "And then get the door. You're unloading the fish first. The forklift driver called in sick, so you're hand-bombing the pallets." Richard turned away from the window. He looked at his dirty, blood-stained gloves. He looked at the stained instrument panel. "Roger that, Captain," Richard whispered. He opened the door to the biting wind of Anchorage. He stepped out into the snow, not as a sky god, not as a commander, but as an old man with a bad back and a ruined name, ready to carry dead weight in the freezing dark. This was the bed he had made, and tonight, like every night for the last year, he would have to sleep in it. 2 years later. Fate has a funny way of closing loops. Richard was in Anchorage for a layover. He was sitting in the corner of a dingy pilot lounge at the cargo terminal, eating a cold sandwich. On the wall, a TV was playing the news. And in business news today, Apex Horizon Aviation has been named Operator of the Year for the second year in a row. Under the leadership of CEO David Sterling, the company has expanded its fleet and launched the Vance Initiative, a scholarship program ironically named after a former employee, dedicated to training minority and female pilots from underprivileged backgrounds. Richard stopped chewing. He stared at the screen. The camera cut to David Sterling. She looked radiant, powerful, and impeccably professional. She was standing in front of the very G650ER Richard used to fly. "We believe," David said to the reporter, "that the cockpit should be a place of skill, not prejudice. We removed the barriers, and we removed the toxic elements. Since then, our safety record has been flawless." The reporter laughed. "And is it true that you still fly the line, Mrs. Sterling?" "Absolutely," David smiled. I'm flying to Tokyo this afternoon. A pilot never stops learning. Richard felt a bile rise in his throat. The Vance Initiative. She had used his name, his legacy, to fund the exact people he had despised. She had turned his name into a symbol of what not to be. It was the ultimate erasure of his ego. He stood up, unable to watch anymore. He walked out of the lounge and onto the ramp. Just then, a sleek shape descended from the clouds. It was a Gulfstream G650ER, tail number NSMHunt80X, his bird. It taxied silently past the cargo area, sleek, clean, and beautiful. It was heading toward the private VIP terminal, miles away from where Richard stood in the slush. Through the cockpit window, for just a fleeting second, Richard saw the profile of the pilot in the left seat. It was her. She looked focused, calm, in command. Richard looked down at his own hands. They were dirty. His parka was torn. He turned back to his DC-6, which was being loaded with crates of frozen crab. "Hey, Vance!" his foreman yelled. "Get the de-icing fluid. We got ice on the wings." "I'm coming," Richard whispered. He grabbed the hose. As he sprayed the chemical fluid onto the old, dented wing of the cargo plane, he watched the Gulfstream take off in the distance. It climbed sharply, effortlessly, piercing the clouds and disappearing into the sun. Richard Vance stayed on the ground, in the cold, exactly where he belonged. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Captain Richard Vance. He spent 20 years building a career, and 20 minutes destroying it. He thought his rank gave him the right to belittle others. He thought his experience made him untouchable, but he learned the hard way that in aviation, and in life, character counts for just as much as skill. David Sterling didn't just fire him. She dismantled the very ego that fueled his hatred. She turned his prejudice into progress, using his failure to fund the future of aviation. Richard ended up in the cold, hauling frozen fish, haunted by the ghost of the life he threw away, while David soared above him, proving that the sky belongs to everyone. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think the Vance Initiative, naming the scholarship after him, was a stroke of genius, or was it too petty? And have you ever worked with a sky god, like Richard, who thought they were better than everyone else? Drop your stories in the comments below. I love reading about your experiences with instant karma. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please hit that like button. It really helps the algorithm show this video to more people. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. We drop new stories of drama, revenge, and redemption every week, and you don't want to miss the next one. Thanks for flying with us today. Stay safe, stay humble, and I'll see you in the next video.